Hello. Hello. Welcome to those of you watching, and welcome to our panelists. This event is being recorded. I'm Becky Simon with the League of Women Voters of Naperville. League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization. We do not support or oppose candidates for public office. Rather, we believe that a well-informed voter is best able to make their own decision at the ballot box. Why are we hosting this particular event? Well, League of Women Voters of Naperville is a longtime advocate for local environmental issues, such as recycling, lead remediation, and household hazardous waste collection. So it's just natural for us to work with the Environmental Voter Project, who aims to increase voter demand for environmental leadership by turning environmentalists into consistent voters. Now I would like to introduce Nathaniel Stinnett, founder and executive director of the Environmental Voter Project. Nathaniel?
Hi, thank you, Becky, and thank you to everyone for taking the time to learn about our work at the Environmental Voter Project, and also for what I hope will be a really, really great Q&A and discussion after I describe our work to you. But before we jump into things, I just want to thank everybody at the League of Women Voters of Naperville, everybody involved with ACE and Citizens Climate Lobby, and any other organizations that have helped to bring people to this discussion tonight. I think no matter your political persuasion, we can agree that we are in a difficult moment in time. And the only way we get through these difficult moments is by having curious people come together in meetings like this, virtually or in person, to learn about new things that are going on. So thank you to all of you who are taking the time to be here tonight. This is going to last for about an hour. I'm going to make a brief presentation about the Environmental Voter Project's work, and then we'll get into a great Q&A discussion. So if you can hold your questions for that Q&A, that would be wonderful. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. All right. Please jump in and stop me, any other co-hosts, if for some reason this screen sharing isn't working the way it ought to. As Becky mentioned, I'm Nathaniel Stinnett. I'm the founder and executive director of a nonprofit called the Environmental Voter Project. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the work that we do, a little bit about why we focus on that work, and how we get it done. And hopefully that'll spark a really interesting discussion for us. In a nutshell, the Environmental Voter Project is a nonpartisan nonprofit that just does two things. One, we identify environmentalists who don't vote. And then two, we turn them into better voters. That's really it. We find environmentalists who aren't voting, and then we turn them into better voters. So what that also means is we don't do a lot of the stuff that your typical environmental nonprofits do focus on. For instance, we don't endorse candidates. We don't lobby for particular policies. As odd as it might sound, we don't even try to persuade people to care more about climate or the environment. A good way to think of us is we're not in the mind-changing business or the opinion-changing business. Instead, we're in the behavior-changing business. We find the people who are already with us, the people who care so deeply about climate or other environmental issues that it's their #1 priority, yet they aren't voting, and then we make a purely behavioral play. We just try to nudge them into becoming better voters. And the reason we focus on that is because one of the biggest reasons, if not the biggest reason, we can't get consistent environmental leadership in the United States, not just at the federal level, but also at the state and local level, is simply there aren't enough voters who prioritize environmental issues. And I'd like to start by going back in time to an election I'm sure we all remember, and that's the 2016 presidential election. And if you look at polling of likely voters heading into the 2016 presidential election, only 2%, just 2% of likely voters heading into that election listed climate or the environment as their top priority. That's it. And then another 2% listed it as their second highest priority. We just had our first presidential debate of 2020 last night. Let's think back to the 2016 presidential debates. How many of you watched in frustration over a whole bunch of things, but at least one of them that frustrated you was you saw 3 debates where there wasn't a single question asked about climate, not a single one from any of the moderators. Well, this is why. This is why. When so few voters deeply care about a particular set of issues, boy, is it hard to get politicians to pay attention to those issues. Boy, is it hard. It's also hard to get the press and moderators to pay attention to those issues. And heading into the 2016 presidential election, only 2% of likely voters cared enough about climate or the environment to list it as their #1 priority. Now, the good news, as I'm sure many of you are aware, things have changed in the last 4 years. Many more people care deeply about climate and the environment, and thankfully, many more voters do. So let's fast forward 2 years to the 2018 midterms. In the 2018 midterm elections, if you looked at exit polling data, 7% of midterm voters listed climate or some other environmental issue as their top priority. Now, to be clear, this is an apples to oranges comparison because the midterm electorate is different in size from the presidential election electorate, and midterm voters are slightly different from presidential voters. But even with that apples to oranges comparison, by any objective measure, that jump from 2% to 7% shows that something was going on there. From 2016 to 2018, many, many more voters started listing climate or the environment as their top priority. And I would suggest to you, this is a significant reason why coming out of the 2018 midterms, you have a lot of groups like the Sunrise Movement starting to get a significant amount of power because politicians go where the votes are. And when many, many more voters start caring deeply about these issues, all of a sudden advocacy groups have a lot of power behind them to push for their agendas. And sure enough, in 2019, we start seeing a lot of Democrats run for president focusing on climate change. By the end of 2019 and early 2020, these numbers had risen so much that 12% of likely presidential voters listed climate or the environment as their top priority. Now those numbers have gone down a bit since coronavirus hit, but actually not a lot. Actually down to 8, 9% in many polls, in some polls still as high as 12%. But what I want to suggest to you, because I think this is crucially important, is that even though we have seen significant growth in the number of voters who don't just prefer government action on climate change, but actually prioritize it as a top priority, we can't pat ourselves on the back because these numbers, they're not even close to being enough. 8, 9, even 11, 12% of voters listing something as their top priority is a heck of a lot better than 2%, but it's nowhere close to being a top 2 or top 3 priority issue. It's not at 26% or 30% or even 20%. And when you're running for president or senator or state legislature, or even if you get elected and you're deciding what to spend your political capital on, chances are you're not going to go out on a limb and do something really hard for something that 8 or 9 or 11 or 12% of voters list as their top priority. It's just a really hard thing to be brave about. And this lack of demand in the electorate for really, really strong climate leadership is a huge, huge problem. And one of the biggest reasons it's a problem is what I'm about to tell you. And I know this slide is very boring, but believe me, it's important. In fact, if there is one thing you take away from this presentation tonight, please, please let it be this. Who you vote for is secret. My guess is everybody listening knows that. We grow up understanding that our ballot is secret. But I want to be totally clear here. Whether you vote or not is public record. Who you vote for is secret, but whether you vote or not is public record. What elections you cast your ballot in, city council, mayor, president, governor, senate, the elections you show up in and the elections you skip, that is public record. And not only is it public record, take it from someone who has run dozens of political campaigns. That piece of information there is quite literally the essential building block for how all campaigns are run and how all policy is made. Because if you literally know by name and street address on public voter files who is likely to vote in the election you care about and who is not likely to vote, well, let me tell you, that really changes the type of people you talk to in your campaign and the type of people you pay attention to when you're trying to figure out what voters care about. And so let me bring you into the first meeting that any campaign has, whether you're running for Senate or City Council. Let's say Becky, for better or for worse, has hired me to be her campaign manager. Congratulations, Becky, you're running for governor of Illinois, and you've hired me, and we're in our first meeting. And so Becky sits down with me and a lot of consultants and all these other people, and the first thing we do is we open up our laptops and we look at public voter files to see who is likely to vote in this gubernatorial election that Becky wants to win. And like any campaign, we have limited time and we have limited money, and all we care about is getting more votes than all of our opponents. And so when we open up public voter files for the state of Illinois, the first thing we notice is, oh, okay, here are a whole bunch of people who aren't registered to vote. Well, we're not going to talk to them. Oh, here are a bunch of people who are registered to vote, but they never actually do. They never show up. Well, you know, we have limited time, limited money. I don't think we can talk to them either. Oh, well, here are people who are registered and they vote, but they only vote in presidential elections. We're running for governor on a midterm cycle. I don't know, maybe if Becky is an amazing fundraiser, we'll go after them. But no, what we will likely end up doing, and what most campaigns end up doing, is finding the people who vote in gubernatorial elections, or even the ones who vote in municipal elections, the super duper voters. Those are the people we will talk to, because those are the people we know are going to show up. And only if we're rolling in cash are we going to start dipping into the people who have a 70 or 80% likelihood of voting. And so campaigns almost always only target likely voters. And that's important not just to understand how campaigns are run, but how policy is made. Because if campaigns usually only target likely voters, who do you think they poll? Yeah, they only poll those likely voters. And so what that means, and again, this is so important, I'm going to say it a few times, whether you vote or not is public record. What that means is campaigns don't care about the opinions of non-voters. They only bother to poll and figure out the issue preferences and priorities and opinions of the people who they know have a public history of showing up in the elections that they care about. And they literally know them all by name and street address. It's public record. And I know, believe me, I can hear the words coming out of my mouth. I know how cynical this sounds, but it's something that we accept in every other aspect of our lives, right? I mean, we go to Starbucks and we expect them to try to like market their products to coffee drinkers, right? Not to people who don't drink coffee. It would be silly for Starbucks to try to market to people who don't drink coffee. Well, politicians don't care about non-voters. Similarly, like, would we expect Ford Motor Company to put together like a $10 million marketing campaign to 3-year-olds? No, 3-year-olds don't buy cars. Ford does not care about 3-year-olds. They care about people who drive cars. And it's so essentially important for people who care about the political process and care about policymaking to understand this essential fact. Whether you vote or not is public record. Every politician and every policymaker knows who votes and who doesn't vote in the elections that they care about. And surprise, surprise, they put a premium on the people who actually show up. Their opinions matter. The ones who don't show up, their opinions don't matter. And this is not very good news for the environment, because as I showed you in those 2 previous polls, when you poll likely voters, whether it be for president or midterm or city council or mayor or anything, there aren't nearly enough voters who list climate or the environment as a top priority, not enough to really move these policymakers. Now, I promise you, that's pretty much going to be the end of the bad news. So don't worry, I'm not going to be like an hour-long wet blanket for all of you. There's a lot of good news too. Because part of the reason we started the Environmental Voter Project is because I realized now almost 4 years ago, something really interesting that was going on here. It turns out the reason so few voters care deeply about climate and the environment is not because too few Americans do. In fact, there are tens of millions of Americans who care so deeply about climate and the environment, it's their #1 priority over all other issues. So why aren't these people showing up in polls of likely voters? Well, for one very good reason. It turns out that environmentalists are awful at voting. What we realized at the Environmental Voter Project was that the environmental movement, the climate movement, doesn't have a persuasion problem as much as we have a turnout problem. We have a behavioral problem. There are tens of millions of us who don't need to be persuaded. We've already bought into it. We care so deeply about this stuff, it's our #1 priority. We're just not voting. And as you can see on this slide, 10.1 million already registered voters, these people are already registered, who list climate or the environment as their top priority, didn't vote in the 2016 presidential election, an election that was decided by 77,000 votes across 3 states. 10.1 million of them. They just didn't leave their homes, already registered, and they care deeply about climate or the environment. I know this is frustrating, but what I want to suggest to you is that this is also an enormous opportunity, because we live in a moment in time where it's become increasingly hard to change people's minds about pretty much anything, especially climate change and environmental issues. Boy, is it hard to change people's opinions about climate change. But what this shows us is that there are millions, tens of millions of people who don't need their minds changed. They're already with us. These are people who, like, you shake them awake at night and they're going to scream climate change. They just aren't voting. And that is a solvable problem. That is a behavioral problem. And I'm not going to claim that behavioral problems are easy to solve. They're not. But they're a heck of a lot easier than changing people's minds, and a heck of a lot cheaper than changing people's minds. So the fact that we have this huge latent pool of political power in the climate movement that is yet to be activated, well, that is great news. That is an enormous opportunity. That's a huge amount of power that we've got in our back pocket that most other issue constituency groups don't have. And this is what we focus on at the Environmental Voter Project, is finding these non-voting environmentalists and getting them to vote. Before I jump into how we do it and then some of the results that we're getting, I just want to spend one more slide defining the parameters of this turnout problem, because I think it's really important for everybody to understand. If we go back to the 2014 midterm elections, 44% of registered voters voted, but only 21% of environmentalists who are registered to vote turned out. That's a huge, huge turnout gap. 2016 presidential election, 69% of registered voters voted. Again, I'm using a denominator of registered, not eligible voters here. 69% of registered voters voted. 50% of environmentalists did. Still a big, big turnout gap. 2018 midterms, as I'm sure everybody on this call is aware, very, very high turnout rate. A so-called blue wave election, but it actually wasn't even just progressive turnout. It was high turnout across the board. It was actually the highest turnout rate for a midterm election going all the way back to 1914. And believe me, people were motivated to vote then. It was an election taking place like 3 or 4 months after World War I broke out, the war to end all wars. That was the last time we had midterm turnout rates this high. Environmentalists did a lot better, 53%. But boy, oh boy, can we not pat ourselves on the back for this. We, who are facing like truly existential crises, cannot be happy with barely almost scratching and clawing our way up to average. Believe me, when you look at other issue constituency groups, they're not trying to break even. They're not trying to hit the national average of turnout. If you look at people, for instance, who care deeply about gun rights, if you look at NRA members, they're not trying to get 57%. Their only question is, are we going to hit 85 or 90% in an election? They vote like it's their job. They vote in library trustee elections and dog catcher elections. They never miss an election. And that's where the environmental movement needs to be. And the great news is, there are 3 times as many of us as there are people who care deeply about gun rights. But they vote, so they have much more electoral power. This is what we are trying to take advantage of at the Environmental Voter Project, and this is what I think is so important for people in the League of Women Voters and people in CCL and just people who care about both civic engagement and climate and environmental issues to understand, is that we have this enormous pool of latent political power in the climate movement. If we just focus on behavior change rather than trying to like change all these climate deniers' minds, we could be unstoppable. We really, really could. So very quickly, I want to get into how we find these people, how we turn them into better voters, and some of the results that we're getting. And then we can get into a great Q&A session and hopefully a really good discussion. So very quickly, it's a 3-step process. And I hope you'll bear with me. I'm not going to dive into an enormous amount of detail on these 3 steps because I don't want to presume to know what aspect of our work you're most curious about. Like that's what the Q&A is for. But I will touch on each of these just to give you a flavor. The first is we use data analytics to build predictive models to individually identify these environmentalists on voter files. And I'm going to go into some detail on this in the next few slides. But to be clear, these are the same tools that, say, the Biden campaign and the Trump campaign and most US Senate campaigns now use to target people on an individual basis. Political campaigns don't target by demographic groups anymore. You might hear journalists say, oh, you know, soccer moms or NASCAR dads or white working class men are swing voters. But like, that's just shorthand, or they don't understand what's going on. Campaigns target on the individual level. And what we are able to do is individually identify on voter files these people who care so deeply about climate or the environment that it's their #1 priority, yet they're not voting. And that brings us to this next step. Once we're able to do that, that frees us up to bypass the hardest, most expensive part of politics, which is changing people's minds and educating them about issues. We don't need to do any of that stuff. We know these people are dyed-in-the-wool super environmentalists. They just need a behavioral intervention. They need to vote. But because we're freed up from all that stuff, we don't even need to talk about the environment. We can be completely agnostic with our messaging. Hell, we could talk about chocolate chip cookies at that point if it was the best way to get these people to vote. And what we do at the Environmental Voter Project is we run dozens of randomized control trials each year, isolating which messages over which communication channels to which subgroups of environmentalists work best in turning them from non-voters to voters. So we're almost like this full-time field laboratory, figuring out the best behavioral science messaging to change these people's voting habits. And then the third thing is habit reinforcement. As I'm sure comes as no surprise to any of you, if you're trying to get someone to change their habits, you can't just talk to them every 2 or 4 years when there's a big, sexy federal election going on. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. That's not how you would get someone to like exercise more often, right? Like tell them to show up at the gym every 2 years. Like, no, that doesn't work. It's not how you get someone to change their eating habits, is talk to them every 2 years. Well, it's the same thing with voting. And so what we do at the Environmental Voter Project is we view every election, no matter how small, local, state, federal, primary, general, special, every election is an important behavioral intervention opportunity to help turn non-voters into voters. And so when we go into a state, and I'll show you later on what states we're in, we identify all these non-voting environmentalists and then we stick with them, even in elections that have nothing to do with the environment, library trustee races, DA's races. We use them as opportunities to help change their voting habits. So let's dive into a little bit of detail about how we do this, and then we'll get to the Q&A. Very quickly, when I referred to building predictive models, this is what I meant. And again, I'm going to breeze through this, but we can go into more detail on the Q&A if you're interested. What we do and what most sophisticated political campaigns now do is they start by polling enormous numbers of people. These aren't your typical political polls of 600 or 800 people. These are polls of 15 or 20,000 people per state. Huge, huge polls. But we can get away with it cost-wise because we're only asking one question. We're simply saying, what is your number one most important political priority? And we get 20,000 people in a state to answer that question. Then we can isolate the people who responded to that question by saying, oh, climate, or some environmental issue like clean air or clean water. And we work with data scientists to figure out, okay, what do we know about these people who just told us in Illinois that they list climate change as their number one priority? And these data scientists work with data that we have on public voter files. They work with census data. They work with other publicly available data. We only use publicly available data, behavioral and consumer data. And we can start figuring out some really interesting patterns and correlations. For instance, maybe forestry employees are 11 times more likely than the average person in Illinois to list climate as their top priority. Oh, and Latinos and Latinas are 7 times more likely than the average respondent. Oh, and basketball fans are more likely than baseball, hockey, and football fans to list environmental issues as their top priority. Oh, and if you've ditched your landline and only use a cell phone, you're 9 times as likely. And don't read too much into these because no single data point is ever predictive on its own. But what we can do working with these data scientists is combine a whole bunch of these data points and then find some really, really interesting things. That's when we can start saying, if you are a Latina grandmother who lives within 5 miles of Peoria and subscribes to National Geographic and bought a Volvo between 8 and 10 years ago, and you've got 2 grandkids in the public schools, well, holy moly, like you've got a 91% likelihood of listing climate as your top priority. They can find things like this. And what then they're able to do is apply that knowledge, apply those findings to everybody in a state voter file, far beyond the 20,000 people who responded to a poll, and extrapolate off that to try to predict how every single person in the state is likely to care about climate or the environment. And ultimately, what we end up doing, and these are the same tools that very sophisticated political campaigns now use, is we assign a score from 0 to 100 to every single person in a state voter file, every single one of them. And these are the same things that the Biden campaign and congressional campaigns and Senate campaigns are doing right now. What you'll see right here, this is a distribution curve of every voter in the entire state of Florida. Every single one of them. And we've given them all a score from 0 to 100, telling us how likely they are to list climate or the environment as their #1 issue. And as you'll see, the average Floridian only has like a 12% likelihood of listing it as their top priority. But there are literally millions of them, who are 3 or 4 or even 5 times as likely as the average Floridian to not just care about these issues, but list them as their top priority. And because these are individually assigned scores that we send out to outside polling companies to test their accuracy, they allow us with a almost frightening degree of precision to individually target people on voter files based on the issues that we think that they prioritize. And then, as I'll now mention for the 4th or 5th time, it's the easiest thing to just cross-reference that to people's public voting histories. And that allows us to do things like this. Here are the 2,400 registered voters in Portland, Maine, who have a really high likelihood of listing climate or the environment as their top priority, yet they stayed home during the 2016 presidential election. Here are the 42,000 in Philadelphia. Here are the 42,000 in Phoenix, Arizona. We know them by name and street address. We have landline telephone numbers and cell phones for many of them. And we know they're with us, and we know they're registered to vote. They're just not voting. And so that gets us to the second step. Once we find them, we have over 5,000 volunteers at the Environmental Voter Project who, when there's not a pandemic, are canvassing, but now they're also calling and texting these voters with behavioral science-informed messaging to turn them from non-voters into voters. We're also sending them direct mail and digital ads, all based on these now probably over 200 randomized control experiments that we've run, figuring out which messages work best to get these non-voting environmentalists to start voting. And again, I'm not going to go too deeply into the behavioral science, but I'm happy to talk about that during the Q&A if you're interested. But what we have found out, and what the latest generation of behavioral psychologists and behavioral economists have found out, is that the best types of messages, the ones that work best in changing people's behavior, are not the ones that try to rationally convince people of the importance of voting. In fact, that never works. Instead, we try to treat people as social beings. What we do is we try to find out, what norms do these voters buy into? Who do they want to be? Or even more importantly, how do they want to be seen? And we use those behavioral nudges to get them to vote. So I'll give you some examples. We use basic peer pressure. We will text people and we'll say, hey, Becky, did you know last time there was an election, 73 people on your block of Main Street turned out to vote? Totally juvenile, like crap that you would have heard on like the 4th grade playground. But it works. It works because we take societal cues from our neighbors and our peers. And if we think that everybody else on our street is voting, it dramatically increases our likelihood of voting. Another societal norm that we buy into, this is something that probably many of you have seen on campaigns that you volunteered for, and that is voter pledges, getting someone to promise to vote. It's deceptively simple, but it actually relies on some very sophisticated behavioral science. Because it turns out one of the strongest, stickiest societal norms we have is that all of us want to be thought of as honest and trustworthy people. And so if on September 30th, I get Allison to promise to vote, what that allows me to do is follow up right before the election and say, hey, Allison, I just want to remind you on September 30th, you signed a promise to vote, and the election's coming up on Tuesday, and I know it's important to you to be an honest and trustworthy person. And so let's make sure that you keep your promise on Tuesday, and we might follow up with you afterwards to find out how it went. Well, now all of a sudden, instead of me trying to convince Allison of the importance of her one vote out of millions, I've made this very normative connection where the act of voting is now going to prove whether she's an honest or dishonest person. And again, is it like kind of almost silly in how normative it is? Yeah, of course, but it works. It works. And very quickly, so we can get to the Q&A, I'll show you how it works. We launched our proof of concept in 2016 in Massachusetts, then we expanded into 6 states, which I'll show you very shortly. But our first multi-state campaign was the 2018 midterm elections. After submitting our work to randomized control trials, we were able to show that we were solely responsible for increasing turnout 2.7 percentage points over our control group. And 2.7 might not sound like a lot to many of you, but ask Hillary Clinton how big a deal that is. 2.7 is everything in this business. In fact, that was good enough for us being solely responsible while controlling for all outside factors for adding almost 59,000 brand new environmental voters to the electorate in those 6 states. Moreover, after our first full 2 years, we had graduated 93,000 people out of our program. These are people who we were only targeting because they were truly abysmal voters. Yet by the end of 2018, after just 2 years, they had not just voted in those midterm elections, but they had voted in state and local elections. We had turned them from non-voters into super voters. Next year in 2019, we expanded from our 6 original states, which you'll see here, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Florida, Georgia, Colorado, Nevada, into 6 expansion states: Arizona, New Mexico, North Carolina, Virginia, New Hampshire, and Maine. And so these are the 12 states that we're currently working in. And as you'll see, we were active in 613 local and state elections last year. This is what I meant by that 3rd step, habit reinforcement. Most groups that do voter turnout were still sleeping off their hangovers from the midterms in 2019. But we were active in over 600 little local elections because every election, no matter how small, is a crucially important opportunity to change people's voting habits. And sure enough, by the end of 2019, we had graduated 253,000 people out of our program, including, I might add, 51,000 in the state of Pennsylvania, a state that was decided by 44,000 votes in 2016. We've only been in our 6 expansion states for about 11 months, so we don't have graduate data there. We've gotten a lot of attention for our great work. The New York Times named us one of 5 global climate visionaries for our behavioral science and data science work. These other outlets have featured us in cover stories or cover episodes. We've continued our work throughout this year using every single election, presidential primary, local and state primaries, as a way to increase voting behavior and better people's voting habits. And this fall in those 12 states, we literally know by name and street address the 2.5 million already registered super environmentalists who have never ever cast a ballot before. And we're using all of this behavioral science informed messaging. We've got over 5,000 volunteers who are contacting them by text and phone each day, turning them into better voters. We're also running sophisticated ballot chase programs, making sure that every step of the way, because as we all know, voting has gotten more complicated, we're helping people vote early, vote by mail, figure out if their ballot has been received back or if they need to remedy it because something is wrong with it. And this is the work that we do at the Environmental Voter Project every single day. And we're going to wake up on November 4th and November 5th and November 6th and keep on doing it in these states. Because the only way to turn non-voters into consistent voters and to dramatically increase this voter demand for environmental policymaking is by viewing it as a year-round effort, leveraging the latest data science and behavioral science to change these people's habits. So we're going to get to the Q&A, but very quickly, I just want to leave you with this. We've got 34 days left. I think everybody is aware of that. Moreover, 1.5 million ballots have already been cast. I mean, I think it's very important to understand that November 3rd is not election day. November 3rd is actually when the election ends. Election day has already begun. And so I encourage all of you to get in the game. Whether you volunteer for us or help the Environmental Voter Project or help a campaign or help the League or help CCL or help ACE, get in the game. And I will say one thing. You can go to our website and sign a pledge to vote. I know none of you need it, but if you have children or friends or nieces or nephews who need voting reminders whenever there's an election, You send them to this link, they sign up to get our voting reminders, and whenever they have an election, we'll remind them to vote. Volunteer. If you would like to help contact these non-voting environmentalists for us in our 12 states with behavioral science informed messaging, go to our website, environmentalvoter.org, sign up to volunteer. You'll immediately get all this information about training webinars that happen almost every day. It's a nonpartisan, apolitical messaging, but it's proven to work. And then the last thing I'll just say is be loud and proud. What we know from all of our behavioral science experiments is that the greatest power all of you have is your societal capital, your social capital. Your friends, your family members, your peers, people in your religious communities, in your schools, at work, they all take cues from you. They look to you to see what is acceptable behavior and what isn't acceptable behavior. And so don't just vote. Be loud and proud about voting, because when people see on Facebook or Twitter or at your church or synagogue or temple that you are voting, that's going to change their behavior. We are societal animals, and I promise you, one of the most powerful things you can do beyond voting and beyond volunteering is being loud and proud about the fact that you're doing that. All right, I went 2 minutes over, but we still have plenty of time for a Q&A, and I'm really, really excited for it.
Thank you, Nathaniel. That's great. Really appreciate that. I have gone through all the Q&A that came in through the Q&A feature, and feel free to continue to pour the questions in. I'll start from the top, and then we'll address any that come in while we're doing this live. So I want to back up to when we started talking about environmentalists. And can you just share, like, what's the definition of an environmentalist for us?
Yeah, great question, because obviously there are 1,000,001 ways to define an environmentalist, and each one is idiosyncratic. The way that we define an environmentalist is we go after the true tip of the spear. We are only going after people who care so deeply about climate and the environment that it is quite literally their #1 issue priority over all others. Now, could you define environmentalists in other ways? Absolutely. Absolutely. That is a really, really strict, narrow definition. But we take that purposefully strict, narrow definition because, again, remember, we're not doing any issue education. We're not doing any persuasion. We want to bypass that stuff and just find the most efficient behavioral play. So we're doing what in politics is called a blind poll. We're essentially finding these people and just blindly pulling them out to the polls. And so we don't want to get sort of lukewarm sort of care about the environment people. We want to find these super duper dyed-in-the-wool environmentalists. But are there alternate ways that you could legitimately define an environmentalist? Absolutely. Absolutely.
That's helpful, because we did get a few questions about how you're able to, and you talked about your statistical methodology of how you're actually identifying who they are. But I do think there's just a desire to really understand those 10 million registered voters that are considered environmentalists, or that tip of the spear. Can you say more about how you're actually finding them? Are they saying certain things in social media? Are they responding to polls?
Great question. Yes. So what we're doing is we take an individualized approach in each of those 12 states that we're in. And what we do is we go in and we will get polling responses, enormous polls, like literally get 20,000 responses. And we're not just calling people, we're texting them, we're using online panels, things like that. 20,000, these are huge, huge responses. And what we do is we ask an open-ended question. We're not asking people to stand up and say, like, hey, I'm an environmentalist, I wear Birkenstocks, or, like, obviously there are a lot of loaded terms when you start talking about the environment. No, we just ask an open-ended question saying, what's your #1 political priority? Some people will say climate change. Some people will say clean energy. Some people will say clean air, clean water, environmental justice, open space, land conservation. But if anybody lists some environmental issue as their #1 priority, That then goes into that data analysis mill that I started describing, where our data scientists start using that information to extrapolate and find all the other people in the state who we didn't talk to, who we think have a really high likelihood of listing climate or the environment as their top priority. And I don't want to go too long on this answer, but I know this is really complicated. And I think it's helpful sometimes for people to hear about an analogy. Many of us have bought life insurance before. And even if you haven't, you've at least seen like enough like bad daytime television to see advertisements about it, and you sort of get it, how it works. When you buy life insurance, the first step is to answer a whole lot of questions about yourself. You say, oh, you know, this is how old I am. This is my medical history. This is how much I exercise. This is how much I drink and eat. And no, I don't like to dive out of airplanes. And you give them all this information, and it helps them build a risk profile for you. And they're essentially doing the same thing that we do. They're building a predictive model. They don't call it that. They call it an actuarial table, and it's slightly different. But what it allows them to do is, with a very high degree of accuracy, not to get morbid, but like predict how long you're going to live. And if they get it wrong even by a little bit, the global economy crashes. Well, we're pretty much doing the same thing, but we're not trying to predict how long everybody's going to live in the state of Georgia. We're taking all this data to predict, okay, who are the super environmentalists? And then let's isolate the ones who don't vote so we can turn them into better voters.
That's helpful. Thank you. And can you talk a little bit about who they are? So there were several questions about who are these people. So I think there's demographic related questions. Who do they typically align themselves with politically? Can you paint a profile?
Absolutely. And it's a great question, because I think it's going to cut against many of the stereotypes that many of us carry in our heads about who the typical environmentalist is. Now, again, before I answer, I want to be clear. We have a very unique idiosyncratic definition of environmentalist. What I'm about to tell you here is these are the people who list it as their top priority. But what I can tell you is this: they ain't me. I don't know if the environmentalists used to be like yuppies in Patagonia fleeces driving around in Priuses, but it's not that way anymore. What we have found is these sort of first priority environmentalists are more likely to be African American or Latino, Latina than white. They are more likely to make less than $50,000 a year than more. And yes, they're more likely to be young than old, but that hides a lot of interesting nuance. For instance, we have found a significant number of women in their 60s and 70s who care deeply about climate or the environment. And that brings me to maybe the last demographic thing that I'll bring up. In every single one of our states, we see a gender gap. So women are always more likely than men to list climate or the environment as their top priority. But what's really interesting is we also always see that gender gap grow with age. By which I mean, if you look at people in their early 20s, women are only a few percentage points more likely than men to list climate or the environment as their top priority. But the older you get, the wider that gender gap grows, such that when you're looking at people in their 60s and 70s, sometimes women are 30 percentage points more likely to list climate or other environmental issues as their top priority. So yeah, this is not the like stereotypical environmentalist that I think many people carry around in their heads.
And can you say more about, that's really helpful, because yes, based on some of the questions, I think we were leaning towards that stereotypical, what we all have in our heads. Is there anything though that you can offer just with regard to their potential political viewpoints? So for instance, socialism, or for instance, Bernie fans, you know, like, is there anything that you can share too?
Yeah, so not a lot, and not because I'm trying to be squirrely, it's just that stuff's secret. Like, who people vote for is secret. Like, no one has that data. The only way to really get that information is to ask exit polling questions or ask, you know, candidate preference questions. And boy, are those hard to be really precise on. And what's more, you know, we're a nonpartisan organization. So like, what, you know, what the heck are we going to do with that data? Now, what I can tell you is this. So the big answer to your question is kind of like a really big, I don't know, Nobody knows. But there are a few things that we do know. One is far fewer of these people express preferences for third parties than you would expect. Far, far fewer. Now, obviously, that varies from election to election, but just far, far fewer. 1%, 2%, like really, really low. Voter registration data is kind of all over the place because, as I'm sure many of you realize, every single state has its own unique way of registering voters. So for instance, like I live in Massachusetts, dark blue liberal Massachusetts. Well, you know what? Only 36% of registered voters in Massachusetts are Democrats. 53% are unaffiliated. We are in a minority. And so like if you just look at voter registration data in Massachusetts, you'd probably think like we're a purple state, which obviously we're not. And so even the party affiliation data is difficult to give you. What I can say is we notice a lot of sort of issue cross-pollination, which might help you understand who these people are sort of on an ideological spectrum. In many of our states, the two issue priorities that are most commonly shared by these like climate first people are, they are also really, really likely to be pro-choice and be very serious in their pro-choice views. And they are also very, very likely to support gun control and again, prioritize it. That varies from state to state, but that's all of the sort of ideological data that we have because the rest is hard to measure.
That's helpful because that kind of is the follow-up question was related on, so obviously just getting people to vote is your number one platform. Is there anything though that you can share with how getting people to vote then turns into support for environmental policy and making the environment better?
Absolutely, absolutely. It is, I mean, even in this hyper-partisan world that we live in, I think it's important to understand that there is still one thing that all Democrats and Republicans share. One thing they all have in common, and that is, boy, do they like to win elections. Democrats and Republicans like to win elections. And so what they do is they go where the votes are. They go where the votes are. It's the simple arithmetic of how politics works. Either you go where the votes are, or you don't get to be a politician anymore. And I think at a very basic level, most of us perhaps on this call, and certainly most Americans, are deeply cynical about politics. And we think, oh, politicians will do whatever it takes to get elected. Well, yeah, you're right, they will. And so what that actually means is not that your vote doesn't matter, it means that your vote is the only thing that matters. And I'm just going to very quickly give two proof points. One, there's a whole lot of research, and I'm forgetting the people's names, but it was two researchers at Princeton about 10 years ago, and then about 13 or 14 years ago at Columbia, did a whole lot of research that figured out that policymakers are much, much, much more likely to represent the preferences of voters than of non-voters. Surprise, surprise. The second proof point is a really interesting story that I love from the 2018 midterm elections. Many of you might know Carlos Curbelo, a fairly moderate Republican from South Florida. I think he was in the 27th or 28th congressional district. He was defending his seat against Democrat Debbie Mucarsel-Powell, who ended up winning. The National Republican Congressional Committee, the entity that supports Republican congressional candidates, started running ads attacking the Democratic challenger for taking a donation from the coal industry. Now, I want to be clear here. The NRCC doesn't have any problem taking money from the coal industry. I think we all know that. They don't have any problem with fossil fuel money. Why were they doing this? Because in South Florida, you win elections by being pro-environment. And so they went where the votes are. They went where the votes are. And so, yeah, there are a lot of proof points that show if you simply dramatically increase the number of environmentalists who will vote, politicians will follow. because nothing motivates a politician more than the prospect of winning or losing an election. Nothing.
Got it. Helpful. Thank you. Okay, so kind of getting back to what does make the voter vote, make the registered voter that is an environmentalist and hasn't voted vote. There's a specific question on what channels have worked most successfully for you.
Yeah, so really great question. So as a reminder, the 5 channels that we use are door-to-door canvassing, although not now during coronavirus, text messages, phone calls, digital ads, and direct mail. We view this through 2 lenses. 1 is which are the most effective, 2 is which are the most efficient. By effective, I mean, which are the ones which increase turnout the most per contact made. Efficient is which are the ones who increase turnout the most for the least amount of money. So the most effective is always door-to-door canvassing. Now, it's often inefficient. Even if you have volunteers doing it, it costs money to organize them and things like that. And if you don't have a really dense turf, sometimes it just takes a long time to knock on people's doors and things like that. But old-fashioned face-to-face conversations is still not only the best way per contact made to get someone to vote, it also has the highest ceiling. You can also increase turnout the most through a great canvassing campaign, especially in low turnout elections. After that, I would say direct mail is the most effective. As for the most efficient, it's absolutely text messages and digital advertisements, especially text messages, although I assume that's going to go off a cliff because 2 years ago, no one was getting text messages and now everybody is. But text messages at 5 cents a pop going out are just a really cheap way to do this. And then the last thing I'll just say is, if we had been having this conversation 9 months ago, I would have said, oh, well, Kelly, like, don't even bother calling people anymore. And that's not the case anymore. I mean, it's like we're back in 1985 and people are picking up their phones and we're getting contact rates of like 5.56% on landline telephones. Now, do I know how much that's going to increase turnout? No, because like coronavirus has put us in this weird new world where all of our previous experiments for calling people don't really apply. But what I can tell you is if a campaign asks you to make calls now, do it, because it's a totally different world than the world we were living in a year or 2 years ago. People are picking up their phones now.
Interesting. There was a question related. I have 2 more questions and then we're probably at time. But that's related, and that is with all that's going on with regard to mail-in ballots and potential voter fraud. Is there any concern, and if so, what are you doing to address that with regard to your nonprofit?
Great question. So first, I will say the chances are the number of people who get hit by a bus on election day is going to be greater than the number of instances of voter fraud. It always has been in the past. So we should, I'm not saying we shouldn't be vigilant about voter fraud, but it is a largely made up problem. That being said, there is no doubt that with a pandemic raging and a kneecapped postal service, the logistics of voting are just a heck of a lot harder than they ever have been. And so what we're doing as an organization is running what's called ballot chase programs. And what this is it's very hard. You can really only do it if you have a whole bunch of well-trained volunteers and a really nimble data operation. But what we're doing is we are delivering messages to our non-voting environmentalists at the precise moments in time when they need this information. So this is what I mean by that. For those people who are interested in voting by mail, we helped them sign up for vote by mail. But as we all know, that ain't nearly enough. So what we also do is we find out when are their ballots going to be delivered. And we text and call them and say, hey, Kelly, your ballot's probably going to show up at your door in the next 2 or 3 days. Make sure you don't throw it out, because a lot of people throw out their ballots. Then a few days after we think you've gotten it, we text you and call you again. Say, hey, Kelly, just want to make sure that you got your ballot. 1, again, so you don't throw it out. 2, so you can recognize if there's a problem and your ballot's been delayed. And 3 is a behavioral science technique. The most common excuse in mail-in elections that people give for not voting is claiming that they never received their ballot. But 30% of people say that, so we know they're lying. And so it's this trick to try to get you to admit that you received your ballot. Then the third thing we do is at the beginning of early in-person voting, we ping people again and say, hey, in-person voting has started. And then most importantly, every 3 or 4 days after that, we check with local election officials to see who has voted and who hasn't. Because again, for the 5th time tonight, I'll say, whether you vote or not is public record. So we know which of our targets haven't voted yet, and we'll contact them and say, Kelly, we noticed in the latest voter file upload that you haven't voted yet. Can we help you find your closest polling location or Dropbox location? And so with all of that stuff together, we sort of hold people's hands and walk them through the entire process to try to overcome some of the logistical barriers that we have now. And I can tell you, I mean, we already know because we're tracking this stuff, 13,000 of our targets have already voted. We already know that they voted. It's not an enormous amount, but we love the fact that we're already banking those votes. They've already voted.
Awesome. And I know we're just a little bit over time. As I scan through, you actually did cover one of the final questions is why don't people vote? You know, why at the end of all of this, people still don't vote. And let me just follow up with the part B, since we are a little short on time. With other nonprofits specific to like environmental actions like Sierra Club or whatnot, you know, they do a lot. And so there was just a question on, you know, what are your thoughts on, is this all complementary to that type of work effort? So I think why not vote? And then how do you fit in with other environmental organizations in their quest to get people to vote?
Great, great questions. So the first one, we don't have time for me to give a very, very nuanced question to answer to this. And what I'll say is, as someone who lives the behavioral science of how to get people to vote, I can tell you it's really easy for social scientists to set up experiments to tell you how to get someone to do something, how to get someone to vote. It's really hard to do the opposite. It's really hard to set up an experiment that tells you why someone is not doing something. And so I'll encourage you to go to our website, environmentalvoter.org, and look at the Reports and Studies tab. We've done some surveys on this and done some reports trying to figure out why environmentalists don't vote. And the truth is, it's really hard to figure out because it's just one of the hardest things to do in social science. What I can tell you we know is this. For decades, the environmental movement has viewed personal impact in a completely apolitical way. If you're an environmentalist, chances are you grew up thinking, oh, I'm going to change how I get to work. I'm going to change how I eat. I'm going to change the electricity I consume. I'm going to recycle. All of which, by the way, are enormously important, but they have nothing to do with politics. Whereas if you care about immigration or reproductive rights or gun rights, I mean, you view that as inherently political. And so we have a lot of reason to believe that that's part of what's going on here. It's just not how people have viewed environmental impact and environmental action. To get to the second question, yes, we are absolutely complementary with the efforts of other organizations. What a lot of other environmental organizations, what most other environmental organizations do if they are involved in mobilizing voters, is they're trying to elect their endorsed candidates. And boy, is that important. Boy, is it important to elect the right candidates. But if I'm an organization that has just endorsed Kelly, my goal is to help Kelly win, period. I want you to win. And so chances are what I'm not going to do is spend all of my organization's time and money talking to people who probably aren't going to vote. That's not how you win, Kelly. But if nobody talks to those people, if no one talks to the non-voters, well, there won't be a significant pipeline for these other organizations to support people like you. So there are two big ways that we're different and also complementary. The first is we go after these non-voters, whereas those other groups usually go after good voters or what's called drop-off voters. The second thing, we take this year-round approach. Those other organizations that try to elect environmental champions, by necessity, focus on a few really important elections. Whereas we go in, find these non-voting environmentalists in these states, and again, use every election, local, state, federal, primary, general, special, as a behavioral intervention opportunity to turn these people into better voters. And because of that, groups like the Sierra Club often fund us. I mean, we're funded by individual donors. People just go to our website and they donate. But oftentimes these other groups see so much value in our work that they say, oh, wow, well, we can't be involved in that like Fort Collins City Council race, but we know that you're doing great work. Like, can we give you some money? And so, yeah, it's really, really complementary. And I think those groups do extraordinarily important work. And if we do what we're supposed to do, we're going to fill the pipeline for them. We're going to create more demand for their product.
That's amazing. Thank you. And I think we've covered many of the questions. I would like to just say thank you very much to Nathaniel for your time and for you taking this opportunity to speak to the League of Women Voters and our community here. And thank you to everyone who has tuned in. I'll leave you with this. We do have a recorded version of what you saw here that we'll post on our website and also on our Facebook page. And here is the call to action slide that Nathaniel shared with us earlier. So you can take those away as food for thought. So thank you so much and have a wonderful night. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.